Hello everyone, this is Noor Mousa.
Hi, I'm Alannah Travers.
Welcome to Confused Iraqi. Hi Alannah, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. I'm really excited to be here on your new podcast, which I know you've been planning for a very long time.
Yeah, very, very long time.
I'd love to know about it.
Yes, so actually that podcast has been in the planning for 3 years now. I think more than 3 years.
Wow.
Since 2019. I was in the UK and the idea clicked that I should be talking about my experience as Iraqi, traveling around and then also interacting with the world. And then I remember when you asked me like why confused Iraqi, and whenever I say why confused Iraqi, well, because I feel like every learning experience, every traumatic experience here being as Iraqi is more like not really a learning and a build up to the character, more of like confusion moment. So I'm a very confused person, and I would like to share the experience of an Iraqi, but also all of that confusion that comes with being an Iraqi in this age.
Exactly, and sort of tracking the history of Iraq's recent history, which is something that I'm really interested in. And like I said, I'm not Iraqi, but I've lived here for a year, and I've come to know Noor and lots of other amazing people. And every single time I talk to Noor, I learn something new or some incredible piece of history or family stories. And I was really excited when she asked me to talk to her on a podcast about it.
So for this first episode, we're going to talk about the Kuwait War and the time around that.
Great. And perhaps for some listeners listening, this might be like one of the first big news events they know about Iraq. You know, certainly for me, this is the first thing I learned in history about the Gulf War, which was sort of 1990s. It's when Iraq invaded Kuwait, and 1991 is when sort of the US-led coalition, which let's not forget was also supported by the UK, was involved in trying to kicking Iraq out of Kuwait. And I've always been very interested in how the lived experiences were for families in Iraq at this time. There's much to be read about sort of geopolitics, and actually I would really recommend this guy called, I've been listening to an interesting podcast with a friend, it's called Roy Casagrande, and he was giving a curious interpretation of the British involvement in the Gulf War, and particularly Margaret Thatcher, who was sort of pushing George Bush, the father of George W. Bush, to retaliate to Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in 1990 over Kuwait stealing oil from Iraq, literally. And actually internal conservative politics meant that by the time the response came in 1991, there was a different Prime Minister in the UK, John Major. So it was sort of, I'm sort of sidetracking, but basically my point is that the decisions made across the world by people, particularly British and half British, half German, and leaders of my country that have had tremendous impact in Iraq. And this is one example. It's obviously not the only. We'll get on to 2003 later. But waffle aside, I won't give a big rundown of the Gulf War, but it was horrific and many people died. And I would just be really interested to know, you were born in 1992, so you are obviously, probably don't remember a single thing about this. Right.
And wasn't there yet.
No, weren't that. But your family was. And where were they? And what were they doing? And how did they cope?
So let's just start by saying Iraq invading Kuwait, that's a mistake. Many Iraqis, if not everybody, recognize that shouldn't have happened. We caused lots of damage. Not we, the previous regime caused lots of damage to Kuwaitis and to the region itself also. And Iraqis in return went through horrific events in the aftermath of the Kuwait War. At that time, I wasn't born. I was born 2 years after Kuwait War. At that time, actually, my parents were expecting my sister, my older sister, and she was born during the war. My mother is a special needs teacher, and my father is a military soldier in the military. During that time, they met in an interesting story.
And where were they living also, by the way?
So my mother, she's from Baghdad.
Yeah.
My father is from Najaf. Najaf is a South Baghdad city, is one of the holiest places around the world for Shia, is the holiest place for Shia. And Najaf is a very interesting city because it has the biggest graveyard in the world. I grew up there. I will be telling more stories about living next to the biggest graveyard. But yeah, so it was this couple. They just recently married, and then they watch the news. They know a war is going to happen. My father was in the military. My mother just a teacher, and they got married. They were expecting my sister, and my sister was born during that time. However, so they were in Najaf actually when the Kuwait war happened. It was a very difficult time for Iraqis as well. Their country is fighting. Lots of Iraqis are going there, watching the news and not being happy. I every time I see my family reaction, my parents' reaction when we see any footages from Kuwait war, they are not happy at all. They just feel like that was a huge mistake. We shouldn't have done this to follow Arabs, or not even Arabs, like humans who were part of Iraq at some point and very, very dear people. So, however, interestingly, what happened in Kuwait was very destructive, very inhumane. It can be described in that way.
Although, interestingly, other people in interpretations say that actually the Iraqi invasion was very peaceful of Kuwait. You know, it was the destruction afterwards. It was the US bombing.
But then there was lots of resource destruction also for
and looting.
Yes, but for me as an Iraqi, I was born in 1992, so I was born after in the aftermath. But the aftermath did impact my life. So what happened is in 1991, when the US decided to take action on Iraq invasion of Kuwait. That's a very interesting time, actually. So what happened, two things. Kurds in the north were trying to get their independence, fight for themselves. Iraqis in the south also were feeling that this is the right time to change.
To revolt against Saddam.
Yeah, exactly.
Who maybe we should explain very quickly.
Yeah.
I'm not sure exactly who our listeners are, but let's explain briefly who was in charge of Iraq at the time.
Saddam Hussein.
Who obviously was the notorious dictator who was toppled in the US-led invasion 2003. And maybe you can explain a little bit about the north of the country. Because we're currently in Erbil, which is in the Kurdistan region. And
yeah, during that time, Kurds were struggling because they were somehow going through their own political dynamics, trying to figure out their future, being in Iraq and being also somehow oppressed. Saddam Hussein had Arabization policy, so he was imposing the language through names of forcing Arab names, changing names of institutions into Arabic names, and at the same time, changing the geopolitical landscape. So he was moving Arabs and Kurds through the country.
And Iraq, maybe it's worth also explaining, is a very it's multifaceted country. There's the Kurds in the north and Sunni and Shia population, and it's always been a little bit of a melting pot of different people, right? And particularly in the north of the country, currently the Kurds have kind of independence. Really, it's an autonomous administration. The Kurdistan regional government have pretty much total control of this area. But that wasn't the case in 1999.
No, it wasn't. And then it only happened because something horrific happened, which is the Anfal in Halabja, where people were, chemical weapons were used against people, which is very tragic for Kurds. But then at the same time, Saddam Hussein was doing tragic events for people in the south who were uprising against his regime. And as an Iraqi, that's when I actually take a position on the American support for Saddam Hussein, their shift. So there is a famous speech for Bush the son, telling Iraqis to go to the street. This is their chance to say what they want to say. I think it was the father, not the son.
Oh, okay.
Yes, at that time. And the son was during 2003.
Yeah, also, again, for our listeners who may not know, George Bush was the president in charge of the Gulf War.
Yeah, so he was informing Iraqis, like, this is your chance if you want change, if you're not happy with this regime. And people did. People in different parts of the country started organizing themselves, trying to make that change. But then the US changed its position and started supporting Saddam Hussein. And then Iraqis were the victims now. So an internal within the country use of military on fellow Iraqis who were protesting and trying to organize to themselves to change the situation. So at the time, again, I wasn't born, but just growing up and watching footages on TV right after 2003 on TV, you can find all of these videos and like news on continuously finding mass graves in the south of the country.
And it's horrific. And I knew actually relatively little about this uprising in 1982. And I'd love to learn more about it. You have some recommendations?
Yes. So there is a very nice, but again, very sad story that has been filmed by an Iraqi director. It's a film called Under the Sands of Babylon.
Right.
I highly recommend that film. It can be very emotional to watch it though, but it gives lots of information on the situation at that time. It follows an Iraqi soldier who was escaping Kuwait, not escaping, just returning home, and then everybody who was doing that, they were actually captured, and many of them were killed because they were considered traitors of the regime.
Okay.
So he met lots of people on the way, and many of them did eventually lose their life. I think him also. So I really recommend that film.
Okay.
And there is another film called, I think, The Son of Babylon. It's also around the same time, but it follows a story of a Kurdish grandmother with her grandson going from Kurdistan to south of Iraq looking for her son, and the child looking for his father, and then it follows their journey, not speaking the language, going through different parts of the country, going south and south to the south of the country, and not knowing where is that person they are looking for. And then I'm probably ruining the film here.
Okay, so talking The Sands of Babylon and The Sands of Babylon.
Yes.
And it just popped into my head that very quickly, you mentioned Halabja. That's the Halabja massacre in 1988. I think it was the dying years of the Iran-Iraq War.
Yeah.
Maybe you could say a few words on that for listeners, because we've jumped into the Kuwait War. Well, we should say the Gulf War, I suppose. The invasion of Kuwait that kicked it off. But Iraq had been fighting a war with Iran for 8 years prior to that, 1980 to 1988. And I mean, obviously you weren't born then, but your family was around. What were your memories or your sort of family tales of that?
Again, exactly. It's all about the tales and what you watch and grow up as Iraqi. You are interested in your country history. Somehow it's very disturbing to go through your country history. But for Iran war, I think everybody has a story.
Yeah.
From that time. Not only Iraqis, the people who were in Iraq from different countries also, like Egyptians. I think the Egyptians who were in Iraq at that time, they have a very traumatic experience.
Okay.
And then for Halabja, this is when things are very interesting actually. This is when there is this somehow divide between Arab and Kurds.
There is a lot of conspiracies about Halabja.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
This is the thing. No, there is not a conspiracy. The idea is I didn't really learn much about it. We were away from it.
Well, I see. That's
yes.
Could you briefly explain what the Halabja massacre was?
This is the sad part about it. Not many Iraqis know what happened. Not many Iraqi interacts with the people who went through that, because that's when the country is a bit divided in that sense. It's like you don't really have that opportunity to share that experience.
Well, let's just explain briefly. It was a chemical weapon attack.
Yes, on very innocent civilians. It was mainly. It was justified as the regime trying to defend itself against rebels, Kurds and Arab rebels in the mountains.
Halabjas in the Kurdistan
yes,
region.
on the border with Iran.
Yeah.
And then there were like the stories like there were lots of Iranian fighters on that side, and then that was the way to handle the situation. However, thousands of innocent people lost their life. But this is when I think things are very interesting. I moved to Kurdistan in 2016, and obviously I'm Kurdistan, I meet lots of Kurds, we have conversations. They rarely talk about their experience from that time. I've actually only had one person who talked about their experience in that time. I've told her, like, I want to do a podcast, talk about my experience as an Iraqi, growing up in this region and what happens. And she's like, Yeah, it's a very interesting idea. Us also, I was in Sulaimania, and I know the stories from my parents when Halabja happened. And she started telling me what happened and how her family was trying to escape and survive, and then how things were changing, and people weren't trusting what is happening. They were expecting other attacks, and they were trying to escape and hide. It was very horrific what she told, and I was like, I've never heard that. I've never heard the experience from someone who also grew up in a family that, yeah, somehow. That's I for me that was a bit sad because there is shared trauma, but we don't hear the stories of individuals.
No.
Like I know the history, we can Google it, we can see footages, we can try to find information, but talking to people who have the stories, like the first-hand experience, was for me as an Iraqi who also been through traumatic history, was for me like very emotional, and I keep thinking about it up to now. It's the interaction happened I would say a year ago, and it made me interested in talking more to my Kurdish friends about their experience. Unfortunately, these are not easy topics to talk about. So unfortunately, I didn't manage to have more people talking about it. But yeah, I just wanted to say like everybody in this country somehow have stories or experience something that is a bit horrific. And that time, starting with this time in Iraq history, it's not easy. I wasn't born, thankfully, but then it did impact my life. Now somebody would ask how?
Well, actually, I was going to ask if we could move it back slightly to where we were talking about before, where you were born, and we can discuss finally to sort of end this podcast the period of your life from your birth until sort of just pre-2003. Tell me about the sanctions and tell listeners what these economic sanctions even were.
I'll start with something that happened, which unfortunately happens always when there is a conflict and war. Some people use the opportunity to rob their neighbors, they rob fellow community members. So when American invasion happened, my family went back home because they were taking shelter somewhere else. And my mother always tells me that story. She was carrying my older sister, and she said she was just an infant. I went home, there was nothing. She said I couldn't even find a piece of fabric to wrap your sister. There was nothing. It took us me and your father to buy stuff, to build this house, to make to build a life together. She's like, we had a radio, we had TV at that time, we had a telephone, I had all of these wedding presents. There was nothing. And so they had to start from zero. My father had to also continue working with the military. My mother, she had to stop working because not only she had a child, exactly, the economic sanction happened.
And we should just briefly explain. I mean, it seems outrageous that these sanctions can just so tragically affect people. I mean, hundreds of thousands of children are estimated to have died, and the sanctions were imposed, much like, I suppose, a contemporary sort of comparison. You know, we saw sanctions slapped on Russia across the world, you know, earlier this year, and the sanctions were imposed by the US to force Iraq, firstly, to withdraw from Kuwait, but even when they withdrew, even when they surrendered, they were forced to pay reparations and then to disclose, eliminate weapons of mass destruction, that sort of thing. But they continued throughout the 90s. It was a decade of sanctions and
very long time of not having proper meals. I remember my mother saying that people had to go to street to pick whatever is growing on the road because they had nothing to eat. The flour was mixed with rocks, and they had to eat that. They only had bread for a period of time. There was not really much to eat, so nutrition was an issue. And that's when the oil for food program happened later on, because Iraqis didn't even have a chance to eat like anymore, like normal people. And then again, people already lost a lot and they didn't have resources to rebuild. Very challenging. 10 years of that, I was a child during that 10 years, and I can tell you that sometimes we were very excited, a family of 5, to have 2 eggs to share for breakfast. never seen after 2003. I was like, oh, bananas, what is that? Or like kiwi, what is that? Like so many things. I think kiwi is fine. Like not many people had long time experience with kiwis, but like with bananas, with this, so many different things that we really didn't have. We didn't really know that these things exist.
And of course, Saddam Hussein, his family, the leaders, those in power, were not suffering directly from these sanctions.
I would presume no, because he had a palace everywhere in the country. It's just like, and only people very close, and I would say trusted servant may probably had access to a better quality, but I would say the majority did. Majority of Iraqis were poor. I've never had a chance to have a backpack for school, or like a brand new backpack for school, or have new proper clothes every year. Something my mother tries to sew something.
I'm curious, did you discuss the sanctions? Did you know why this was happening, or did you just have to accept it?
We were children. All we knew that this is the situation. We didn't see someone rich.
No.
To compare to.
No.
There were some nice neighborhoods, but I grew up in, actually at that time I grew up in Baghdad, not in Najaf. Yes. So my family moved from Najaf to Baghdad when I think I was 4 years old. And I had to grow up in a very poor neighborhood in Baghdad. It's one of the poorest neighborhoods in Baghdad. Al-Husayniya, north of Baghdad. And that was actually the best time of my life, going up in a neighborhood where people didn't have much, so they share, and you go out as a child, you're always in the street playing, you don't really have toys, but you make up things. So it was, despite all of the tragedy, thinking about it now, comparing my situation to children maybe probably in other places, it was still fine. And I think this is what I like about Iraqis. Like not only as Iraqi, but this is something I like about Iraqis, especially Iraqi women, mothers at that time. They were really strong peace builders, and very strong on resilience. They really wanted things to be picked up, and they were solution-driven people, women, men, probably mostly women. So like I remember not having something, or like having to like not being able, for example, to go to school because there are street dogs or something. My mother didn't think, oh, that's an issue, or like how do we deal with it. It was like, I'll come with you, I'll try to protect you, I'll show you how to do this. And then there's no water in the neighborhood for weeks. People tried to figure out how to bring water to the whole community, how to distribute that. If your neighbor doesn't have food, like you do tell other people, and then you try to support that neighbor. My mother actually at that time, she had 4 children, and she was alone when we were in Baghdad, because my father, he had a job.
Stayed in Najaf?
No, he had the job. He used to go to the military for months, and when he has a break, he comes home. But for months, she's alone with us. She couldn't also continue teaching. She had children. The salary was basically nothing, so it wasn't worth going to school. Even though she loved teaching, she was, as I said, she was special needs children with special needs teacher, and she loved that. But then it wasn't paying well, and she had to take care of her children. And I remember my mother was sewing, trying to find something to make money out of it, trying to be resourceful. My older sister, she's only 3 years older than me, she had to take care of us. So she was 6 at that time, and she had to take care of 3 children.
Old were you? This was 1996?
I would say so, yeah. So it wasn't easy, but I would say we never felt it, because my mother, for example, she was like, not only us, even children of the neighbors, they used to come, and she tells us stories, and like nice stories, encourage us to use imagination, make toys. This is very funny. We've never been experiencing jealousy from other children, because we all had nothing.
Oh, no.
Yes, but yeah, exactly. That's why I feel like Iraqi stories should be told, because they're not very easy stories.
I have a question to sort of slightly wrap up this episode.
Yeah.
We were sort of talking before about how we could make it a comparative history, or this was 1996, I was born in 1996, what's going on in the UK, what's going on elsewhere. But actually what really strikes me is the title of this podcast is Confused Iraqi, and it's a way, and maybe you can just explain briefly more what you meant about that, and what are the big questions of this period that still mess with your mind?
I think it's confusing how I reflect on my childhood as happy childhood. If you ask me how was your childhood, it's the happiest time of my life.
It's really curious for me to hear these stories
Yes.
and just think, my God, because the overwhelming sense I get is, what the hell was the international community doing at this time? Or how because it also, look, I'm not pretending to know the answers of the world, and I'm incredibly naive, but this, particularly the sanctions, it was deliberate action. It wasn't letting Iraq, to its own internal crises. It was real action.
I have a very personal sad stories here. I had a sister at that time, and we lost her during that time. They were twin. Her last children were twin. And then they are 6 years younger than me. And then my young sister, when she was born, she was struggling a bit. So my mother, basically, obviously, she wanted to treat her, but then the doctors didn't have anything.
Mm-hmm.
They couldn't help her, and we lost her after 2 years. And I remember that. I would say that's the moment when I thought my mother changed. And just thinking that's one of the things that caused the economic sanction is one of the main reasons why we lost my sister. Again, still think my childhood was happy. In the school, in my school, actually, we were about how many? I would say more than 100 child in one small classroom. We never had proper seating. We used to take a piece of fabric with us when we got to school, our books, and this fabric.
No way.
And we put it on the floor, and we tried to find a place and kick each other.
Do you remember what your fabric was?
I remember it. It was a cushion, a cover.
Yeah.
And I used to take it with me and just this is my place. And then we change. And if the teacher likes you, they will allow you to sit in the front. If not, you got to the back. It was very interesting now thinking about it. It was very interesting issues that we had to think about as children. Where do I sit today? Who do I have to fight to find a proper seating? How do I avoid a teacher hearing the person next to me speaking, and then they can cause me some physical harm?
What kind of year was this?
So that was end of 1990 and then beginning of 2000s, which means...
We will come on to the 2003 invasion next episode.
Yes.
Thank you so much for sharing your story and experience of this time with us today.
Thank you for being here for this story. I hope that we didn't confuse people.
Well, actually, interestingly enough, maybe that's the whole point.